Good morning, everybody. As Ricardo said, my name is Carlotta and I live and work in Athens. I'm currently in Mexico on holiday, but I wanted to join you all anyway, because I think this is such a wonderful thing to do. And today we're going to look at a field of research that I hope will encourage some of you who maybe find science a little less interesting, and encourage you to think about how you might apply it to other subjects. And archaeology is one of many. So I just wanted to introduce you to some of this. And it's a little bit more lighthearted and silly, but I really hope that you can enjoy this and understand why we look at a whole range of different materials to understand people. So the title of the talk is You Can't Hide Anything from an Archaeologist, and we're going to look at ancient poo and what it can tell us about the past. Now, first up, I thought I'd just cover what archaeology is, because I get asked this a lot. A number of people seem to think that I design buildings, which I don't, and others think that I dig up dinosaurs, and I also don't do this. This is actually what paleontologists do. What we do as archaeologists is we study the past humans and their activity. And how we do this is that we actually look at their rubbish. And there are many books that are titled Archaeology is Rubbish, and this is quite literally true. We're looking at the material that is thrown away or discarded when it's broken. And through this, we're able to reconstruct huge amounts of information about past societies, cultures, and individuals. So if you think about what you throw away every day and how that might identify you as a person, so the type of yogurt that you like to eat might be different to your friend. These small things can make a big difference in our understanding of the past. And there's a whole range of different material that we can look at. The more traditional that you've probably walked around, in your beautiful countries, are archaeological sites, and these are architectural structures that have been damaged and often covered in soil and then re-excavated. And this can tell us a lot about where people lived, where they produced pottery, where they had conversations about the organization of the administration and all the very boring formal stuff, but it can really bring a lot of information and we can understand kind of the structures in that way. Another really, really useful find and one of the most kind of common finds that we find in archaeological sites is broken pieces of pottery. And this is actually my specialism. I study archaeological pottery. But today I'm cheating and we're moving on to a different subject slightly because I thought it might be a bit more entertaining. But with pottery, we can understand huge amounts of information about the people who made them, but also on a much larger scale, we can look at international trade and exchange. And this is something that we do at the British School at Athens, where I work at the Fitch Laboratory. So those of you who are in Greece, feel very free to get in contact and we can maybe organize a more in-depth conversation about that. Today, what we're going to look at, though, is coprolites, and this is basically fossilized poo. And this really can provide huge amounts of information, as I'm going to show you in just a moment. But you might be wondering, where does the science come in at this point? And this is actually a really good question, and it's something that's debated on a regular basis in archaeology. And that's because archaeology sometimes is described as a humanities subject, and others describe it as a scientific subject. I personally think it's a scientific subject because we are meticulously recording details about everything, and we use a lot of scientific techniques. On top of that, there is a field in itself, which is what I do. I'm an archaeological scientist, and archaeological sciences covers a huge range of different fields of their own. And what we really do is we steal different techniques and methods from other sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology to study the finds that we get on archaeological sites. So these can include things like the field of archaeometallurgy, where we study metals and how they were produced. So in this situation, we're using chemistry and physics to really understand the composition of the material, as well as its performance and and how it behaves when it's being used. More recently, ancient DNA, I'm sure you might have seen some in the news, has become a huge thing that we can begin to explore. And it's really, really exciting because it reveals information about individuals. And the same happens with human osteology, which is basically looking at human remains. And through this, we can tell information about whether they're male or female, how old they were when they died, and any of their associated health issues. and also a lot about the funerary practices that the particular society and culture were using at that time. So you can see we use a whole range of different fields of science to answer a whole range of archaeological questions. Now, like I said, today we're going to focus on coprolites, or poo. And what's really interesting here is that, of course, every living creature has to excrete their waste on a regular basis. And what this can tell us is like so much information about the creature that produced this. And this is, like I said, this isn't actually my speciality. So I've really enjoyed putting this together because I've learned so much from this as well. And I didn't realize quite how much we could tell from this. So what we could say is that it's basically an information package, and this includes human waste, but also animal as well. Now, we can tell a lot about the sociocultural aspects of the group or the individual, and we'll come on to this in a little bit because I realize that that's quite maybe a complicated term. But we can also tell a lot about the diet, so what people were eating and how this might have changed over time. We're able to tell an awful lot of information about their health as well, and also about their identity. So it's really unusual in archaeology to be able to identify an individual. We're often looking at groups of people, whereas when we're looking at an individual coprolite, we can identify that individual, which is really quite unusual and very exciting. But quickly covering the sociocultural thing that I just mentioned, it's a really interesting point and quite something that's very useful to think about. So if you just have a little think about how you might go to the toilet, we often, in this Western world, part of the world, we like to go to the toilet in a small individual room with nobody in it. And it's a very private act, and we can often be quite embarrassed about it. However, in the Roman period, it's really common to find toilets just like this image. They're communal, you sit next to somebody, you might have a conversation. And if you think about how that you might feel about using a toilet like this, it's quite uncomfortable. But this is really important because this tells us a lot about culture and how it changes over time. Another example of this is a really interesting example of
2 minutes, Carlotta.
Okay, there were 3 burials found at Catalhoyuk in Turkey that these date to 9,000 years ago, so a really, really long time ago. And what they found, the archaeologists, when they were excavating, digging up these burials, they found that what had been deposited over the dead body was actually small droppings from carnivores, and they had been deliberately placed over the human body. Now, this to us seems really weird and very odd because we, in our modern day society, in most cultures, we are about cleanliness and we are around funerary practices. So everything is immaculately clean and we preserve, and so it's a very different concept. And we put flowers on the graves, and it's all very nice and very different. And this is a really important consideration because this is showing that what we consider as good and bad or dirty and clean, it's a social construct. So it's something that society has kind of conditioned us to think. And that's not a bad thing. It's not something that I'm criticizing. It's just something that's really worth noting because in the past, things were different. And we cannot always assume that what we experience is the same as what other people experienced in the past. Now, the science of poo is really interesting, as I've said, and what we can tell is quite a lot of information about it. And this can be just from looking at it from a visual point of view. And this is the same that doctors do today. The morphology of it or the shape of it can tell us a huge amount of information about the health of the individual. We can also look at it under a microscope, and we can begin to identify plant remains, animal remains, and this can include pollen, which tells us a lot about the environment at the time. The plant and animal remains can tell us about what the individual or the animal was eating. And then it can also identify a whole range of different parasites and fungi that might be living in the guts of the animal that it's being excreted from. And then on a much more detailed level, we can look at the molecular side of things. And this is really beginning to push the chemistry now. So it's beginning to look at something called starches, which can, if we have starches, we might be having evidence of the consumption of bread, for example. And we can also, again, look at DNA, which is providing us huge amounts of information about the individual. Now, we're going to have a look at one very small case study, and this is quite an impressive one. It was found in 1972 in York, which is in kind of the middle of, you can see here, in the kind of middle to north of the United Kingdom. And it was from an excavation in 1972 of a Viking site. So it's when the Vikings had invaded and they were living in the country. And what they found during excavation was a really large coprolite. And this measures 20 centimeters in length and 5 centimeters in width. So you can imagine it's a really very large one, and quite an interesting one. And the archaeologist that studied this is Andrew Jones, also known as Bones Jones, and he was able to identify that this was a man and who had made this and had lived in York in around 900 AD, so around 1,100 years ago. And what he had eaten was primarily a meat and bread diet, so really not very healthy at all. So we were able to reconstruct who he was and what he was eating. But another really important thing is that it was really quite disgusting when he was able to identify huge amounts of parasites. And this would have meant that the man was really quite unhappy and he was very uncomfortable for a lot of the time, because it meant that he would have been very unwell. And this is a really interesting thing because it's very unusual to be able to identify how a person might have felt in the past. And this is a really unique way of being able to identify that. Now, just to kind of emphasize, this is the last slide, I promise.
Okay, thank you.
And so just to emphasize how important these things are, Andrew Jones, the archaeologist who looks at this, compared the value of this poo to the crown jewels. So really, it's a huge amount of information that we're able to tell from this, and it's very, very valuable. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and I really just wanted again to just emphasize how in archaeology we can use a whole range of different sciences, and it's a really exciting way to apply your knowledge and interest. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. Thank you very much for your effort being here at, I don't know what time is in Mexico, but maybe 4 or 5.
2 in the morning.
2 in the morning. Okay. So thank you very much. And now it's the questions time. We have from Krisa a question: who else has the right to excavate besides the Ministry of Culture and the archaeologists?
That varies depending on the country, but it should only be archaeologists, trained archaeologists, because it's unlike other scientific fields where you can repeat an experiment, you can never repeat an archaeological excavation. Once you've removed it from the soil, that's it. So it should always be a trained archaeologist. But you can find community digs where you have archaeologists helping the community or children to learn to excavate, and that's really exciting. They happen a lot in the UK. I'm not so sure if they happen regularly in Greece, but there are some.
Thank you, Carlotta. We have time for one more question. If we don't have any more questions, we are going to the next speaker. Thank you very much. And okay, our next speaker. We have one last question. Carlotta, if you are still here, how is it possible that the coprolites are so well preserved?
It's a very good question. It's very unusual to find organic material preserved in an archaeological site. And what's required is what we call an anaerobic environment. So this is no oxygen. And this often is a result of waterlogged. So it's a lot of water that's trapping all the oxygen from getting to the object. So this is what happened in the situation in York, and it's what happens in other sites where we find wooden objects and things like that.